Not by politics alone does man thrive. With this phrase, Trotsky opened his book Problems of Life, published in 1923. But why was the great Soviet leader so preoccupied with this problem of everyday life, which is apparently simpler than the great problems of the revolution? What happened is that after the end of the Civil War, the preoccupation of the Soviet leaders turned towards the tasks of economic construction and the raising of the cultural level of the working and peasant masses. Lenin explained that after the victory of the Bolsheviks in the war, the centre of gravity of the revolutionaries' action shifted to cultural work. The economic and cultural backwardness dated back to the old Russian Empire. 80% of the population lived in the countryside, and the absolute majority was illiterate. The Civil War only aggravated the situation. More than 1 million workers who had fought in the Red Army had died. Industrial production had practically stopped during the war, and to restart that production, hundreds of thousands of peasants were brought to the cities to work in the big industries. Poverty, hunger, bad living, and working conditions, and cultural backwardness brought serious problems: alcoholism, domestic violence, rude treatment within families and at work, and low productivity of work in the factories. These were all problems generated by crisis developed after the Civil War. Trotsky explained that in order to move in the direction of building socialism, it was necessary to develop a culture for work and for the whole of everyday life. Capitalism also builds its way of life on the basis of the production and permanent consumption of commodities. To this end, it imposes its value on society, such as individualism, competition between individuals, and the justification of all kinds of exploitation and oppression. Trotsky argued that it was necessary to reject these bourgeois forms of everyday life, but, at the same time, to assimilate the positive aspects of civility and bourgeois culture of the time. Trotsky also said that the raising of culture could not be imposed by state action, but had to come from the slow work of self-education of the workers and peasants. The Revolutionary Party should place itself at the forefront of these economic and cultural tasks, thus fulfilling its political role of leading workers and peasants. Trotsky attached great importance to what he called advances in small things, that is, not only big tasks or big plans, like mass literacy, or increasing technical education, but mainly small changes in the education of the whole population. For example, educating people not to throw cigarette butts or paper on the streets, or in other words, to take care of the cleanliness of the cities. He asked, how can we build a worker state and move in the direction of socialism if we fail to keep the cities clean? We can compare those habits of the old Russia of 100 years ago with those bad habits that we find in our own society, such as behaviour in traffic, in football stadiums, or in the schools. Among the various themes of this cultural work, Trotsky highlighted some aspects. He stressed, for example, the need to increase the professional technical education of the workers, not only to improve the industrial production of the country, but also to win for socialism all the workers without a party. He also paid special attention to the role of newspapers and the media at the disposal of the Soviets in the cultural education of the proletariat. He defended that newspapers should certainly report in a didactic way on the great national and international problems, but not only that. They should also give special attention to everyday problems, to family dramas, to crimes, and give a social explanation for each of these cases in order to educate the population in these problems. Alcoholism was one of the most serious problems for the working class in the Russian Empire and continued to be so even after the revolution. Trotsky stresses in this work the need for a state policy to combat alcoholism. At the same time, he stresses that fighting alcoholism was related to the needs of the working class and the population in general for alternative entertainment and cultural alternatives. He even stresses the role that cinema could play in the new Soviet state, both in terms of entertainment and in terms of education and raising the cultural level of the population. One of the most important aspects of this work is the attention he pays to the problems of family life. On the one hand, there were the long-standing problems of working class and peasant families, mainly the situation of women who were doubly enslaved and also of children who were oppressed in the same way. This situation the revolution had not yet succeeded in eliminating. It is true that the revolution had legally guaranteed women's independence. For example, the right to divorce, the right to legal abortion, the right to education and work, and it had also begun to create the social economic conditions to free them from domestic work. For example, the construction of kindergartens, of laundries, of quality restaurants, but this work was still far from being completed. But besides that, Trotsky said that establishing women's equality within families was the most difficult and the most complicated task, and the one that would take the longest. That alone would require enormous efforts to revolutionize the whole way of life. But to these old problems were added the new conflicts and the disintegration of families caused by the imperialist war, by the civil war, and also by the movements of revolution itself. For example, the new revolutionary militancy of millions of women brought conflicts within their traditional families, and at the same time, the militancy of both members of a couple, for example, also led to conflicts with the religious traditions within the family. Trotsky explains that this transition from the old family to new family types will be a process. In this process, the Soviet state will have to play a role in ensuring the material socio-economic basis for the new family structure. This means guaranteeing public health and education, kindergartens, laundries, popular restaurants to free women from domestic work. Initiatives for new types of family organization cannot come from the state degrees, but must be the fruit of the initiatives of the societies themselves on their way to socialism. Part of this is that the transitional society elaborates its own cultural rites for the most important moments in human life, births, marriages, deaths, which gradually replace religious rituals. In capitalist societies, alternative livelihood projects are also sometimes developed. However, these are projects that close in on their own world and reject or ignore the need of a global change in society. For there to be changes in habits, behavior, and the way of life as a whole, it is necessary, in the first place, a social revolution that destroys the economic foundations of the capitalist way of life. Only a revolution that radically transforms the mode of production and social relations will make it possible to change the way of life in a consistent way as well. One of the problems most keenly felt by the workers was the bureaucratism and even indifference of the state officials to the daily care of the population, especially the poorest. Trotsky stressed the need to demand from the state officials the utmost attention and kindness to the population, and at the same time to combat these bureaucratic methods. In this book, Problems of Life, Trotsky attaches great importance to the necessity of the use of polite language. He explains that the coarseness of language, the bad words, the offences, the rudeness, have their origin in the heritage of serfdom and slavery. That heritage was reflected both in the humiliations produced by the masters and in the rude language used by the slaves to defend themselves. But that relationship is not matched. Coarse language affects first and foremost the oppressed, mainly women and children. According to Trotsky, one of the tasks of the revolution is to eliminate such coarse language. And in an epoch of transition from capitalism to socialism, the culture of the proletariat has its specific limitations. Trotsky stressed the task of the Soviet state to guarantee access for millions of workers and peasants to the most advanced achievements of culture, science, and art of their time, which are the culture of the ruling class, the bourgeoisie. Trotsky asserted that the proletariat cannot develop a culture of its own. After the seizure of power, a transitional epoch opens up, the aim of which is the disappearance of all classes until socialism is achieved. And just when socialism is achieved, the culture will be socialist and not proletarian. Later on, we'll consider Trotsky's positions on art and its role in the construction of a new way of life. We will see in that video Trotsky's position on the different artistic currents that emerged after the revolution, and also how Russian art developed in architecture, in the plastic arts, and even on the packaging of products. In the next episode, we'll talk about the degeneration of the Soviet state and how Stalinism came into being.